You've probably heard that the ketogenic diet can lower blood glucose, but I have actual experience that while it's necessary, it's not sufficient.
I'm Jackie, here to answer questions about my journey from fat weak and sick to trim, strong, and healthy.
So, here's what happened to me. I was diagnosed with diabetes before blood glucose meters were available to patients. As a PhD candidate in biochemistry, I had access to a research library and looked up what blood sugar did with various combinations of carbs, protein, and fat in both normal people versus type 2 diabetics. I attempted to eat the appropriate macros for a diabetic to replicate the normal blood glucose pattern. Later, I discovered that this was called a high-carb, low-fat diet. I discovered Dr. Atkins, then the Eads doctors of Protein Power, then discovered Dr. Bernstein, who believed all diabetics, both type 1s and type 2s, should limit their carbs to 30 grams a day to attain good control. But the best diabetes book was written by my Usenet friend, Jenny Rule. Links to these books will be in the description box below. By then, blood glucose meters were available, and I poked my finger 8 to 10 times a day for a week, and then just kept eating the same way for 3 or 4 months. Then I'd repeat the testing. I discovered I could keep my blood glucose under 140 always, and usually under 120, by limiting my carbs to 50 grams a day. So that's what I did. So all was good for most of 2 decades, managing my blood glucose mostly without medications. But what I didn't realize was that my pancreas was working harder and harder to produce enough insulin to control my blood glucose. I broke my pancreas a little bit. I wound up in the hospital in severe pain and was diagnosed with acute pancreatitis. This is usually caused by either alcoholism or gallbladder problems. I drank alcohol around 2 to 3 times a year, and an ultrasound showed my gallbladder was fine. Pancreatitis is when the pancreas leaks the fluids that are intended to digest food on itself rather than into the small intestine. This hurts like you would not believe. The standard treatment is IV fluids, no food or even water by mouth, so as to allow the pancreas to rest and heal. So after a few days in the hospital pain-free, they tested me with a bowl of sugar-free Jello, and I went home and just ate lightly for a few days. While I was hospitalized, they tested my blood glucose at over 300. When I went home, it never went down again. I ate low carb for several weeks with no decrease. My blood glucose stayed over 300. I went zero carb for a week, just meat and eggs, and my blood glucose stayed over 300. I even fasted for a couple days, and it still didn't come down. I didn't want to see a doctor, as I knew the answer would be insulin. That scared me. When you're diagnosed as a diabetic, they threaten you with insulin, that if you're not good, you'll wind up on insulin. So I was scared. And I thought I'd been good. But apparently my diabetes had progressed anyway. I procrastinated, letting my blood glucose stay high until I had a heart attack. I wound up with a bypass and on insulin anyway. This really confused me when speaking to other diabetics. I still wanted to recommend a low-carb diet because it seemed the best that we had. It had worked for the 2 decades I'd been in ketosis most of the time, but then it didn't work anymore. I believe that living on a ketogenic diet likely slowed the progression of my diabetes, but it hadn't stopped it, and it certainly didn't reverse it. Keto was just not enough. Once I was on insulin, a lot of other problems developed. I had ME, CFS after the bypass, developed adrenal insufficiency and thyroid resistance, and after a few years, I eventually got bad enough lymphedema that I couldn't tolerate insulin anymore. I tried a new drug that landed me in an ICU with diabetic ketoacidosis, complicated by severe cellulitis from the edema. About a year later, that same drug caused necrotizing fasciitis, and I spent over a month in a specialized ICU in another state. Besides nearly losing my leg, I nearly died again from a pulmonary embolism. It required 6 weeks in rehab to learn to sit up, stand up, and walk again. with a walker. Eventually, I managed to get around with a cane. A year later, I woke unable to breathe and called 911. Wound up hospitalized with congestive heart failure and had to sleep sitting up in order to breathe. And a year after that, I had a recurrence and refused hospitalization. I fully expected to die within months and was okay with that, as it was better than winding up in a nursing home. By some strange luck, I ran into Dr. Fung on YouTube and discovered I only had half the answer with keto. The other half was fasting. Keto and fasting are like the blades of a scissors. You need both to cut through and kick diabetes to the curb. Dr. Fung explains in that video, which is one of the ones that changed my life.